Then that brings me to a question. I mean, getting the analogy that I often use is that, and I agree with you completely, is that Bitcoin and cryptos as a whole, I lump them together. It is just a sequoia tree. It's big, it's impressive. You can't ignore it. It's just giant, but it's not the forest. And there's a lot of diversity within the forest. And I look at because there's a lot of people out there I would refer to them as almost purists. They think that Bitcoin and blockchain are one and the same.
Right.
And I try to say to them, no, they're not. Not even in the usage in just as what we see like between various public blockchains, let alone any of the considerations for private blockchains. Just the great amount of diversity. Is there any blockchain program or platform that is of interest to you?
There are many. Again,
you want to share anyone of those?
Understand that I serve as chief scientist at
and you
Human
can't,
Partners,
I know.
And that's a venture capital firm.
Right.
And given where we are and what we are planning to do versus what we have publicly announced, I'm not in a position really to comment on that. But let me just say that we don't in any sense feel that we have any sort of corner on the market. There are many exciting developments that we are tracking and some of which we are contributing to, not just necessarily monetarily, but actively engaged in the discussion. And it's like a kid in a candy shop. There's a lot of opportunity, a lot of good work being done. But again, as much as we admire technology, it needs to be done in service of addressing a genuine need for the people that actually will use the system.
Right.
And this goes to another design principle that was taught to me by one of my mentors many years ago, of distinguishing between who does the work and who gets the benefit. What I mean by that is, oftentimes people imagine these utopian worlds, and I'm a big fan of imagining utopian worlds, okay? But in their utopian world, they imagine that some universal good occurs, and some people will just have to make sacrifices, typically the early users, in order for this wonderful social benefit to occur. That's not going to happen. One has to align who does the benefit with who does the work.
Right.
And as a result, one has to start, in all humility, trying to find an actual problem that needs solving and to address it in a way that even in its smallest implementation, even if in its early stages, there are some people for whom it already delivers an incremental benefit. And so it's really in pursuit of that, asking not what's holding blockchain back, but what actual problems need solving, and how do I build a better mousetrap to address that problem?
Sure.
And when I do that, then I start to gain traction, I gain network effects, and then my ideas maybe have lateral areas where they can be applied to, and they become more important, and so on and so forth. But what you don't see in the real world is someone that says, I want to solve this problem with this revolutionary solution. And it's such a good idea that people will simply find a way to get to it. What you do is you have a radical rethinking about society, but a very incremental way of making it valuable to people along the way.
Right.
That it's useful. And in that way, essentially financially self-sustaining.
Right.
And that there's not as much of in the blockchain space.
Well, speaking of thoughts about solutions, what do you think of the latest announcement by JP Morgan and their coin?
Sure. First of all, let me just say that I do have a glass half full versus half empty feeling. And I'm encouraged for two reasons, okay, at least. One, it's somebody who has identified an actual issue that needs solving.
Right.
Namely, think about this, okay? Our systems, even internally, if you take the JP Morgan announcement on its face value,
Right.
okay, are so arcane that we need a cryptocurrency ledger just amongst ourselves, just so that we can improve reconciliation and settlement.
Sure.
Now that's saying something big in
the
more
DTC
than one
has
way.
been doing that, though, on a broader standpoint, not just internally.
Sure. But here's the other aspect that I feel I'm constantly called to defend when I speak well of a corporate effort.
Right.
And that is, this by definition is not blockchain or cryptocurrency. Why? Because someone's in charge. And that's what I would call purist to the detriment of advancing the very future that people seek.
Sure.
The fact that someone comes up with a solution that only works in a limited sphere, or what some people want to categorize as in a permissioned world, that any whiff of that in any proportion at all immediately invalidates it. It's like you can't call it champagne if it's not from a particular province in France.
Right.
Okay?
Prosecco.
You know, it drinks like champagne, it smells like champagne. But no, it is for religious reasons not part of the revolution.
You made the point
I
exactly.
think that
people take this from a religious viewpoint.
That's
the purists.
That is too rigid a view, even for the benefit of those who have the most altruistic, libertarian, even anarchistic ambitions.
Right.
Because it's a step in the right direction. And there is a decentralizing power that comes by virtue of what it takes to create an immutable record by cryptographic means that will play itself out regardless of the starting point. And frankly, we need all the improvements that we can get.
Okay. So this gets me to a question that you've probably been asked 1,000 times, and that is, where do you think Bitcoin, or not Bitcoin, where do you think blockchain is going to be in the next 10 years?
Well, we talk about this is something we do publicly talk about.
Okay, let's hear it.
Yugen. We talk about 5 areas where we see applicability, and we list them in a sequence of both chronological as well as technological complexity, as well as time to social adoption and refinement. And so let me just walk through 5 stages.
Please.
Okay. First, audit and corporate governance inside existing corporations.
Right.
Okay. We don't need to disintermediate everyone in order to realize some basic benefit that blockchain and immutable records can provide, and that is it makes existing organizations more transparent, more accountable, and operating with higher standards of record integrity.
Right.
Okay. It doesn't take a lot of a jump in technology or refinement in order to accomplish that.
Okay.
Okay. Next, I would go to what I call settlement and reconciliation. There are some industries, banking among them, the financial services space, where settlement and reconciliation consume a great deal of the enterprise budget.
Oh, absolutely.
And if we could if you create a single agreed on ledger,
right,
there's nothing to settle or reconcile.
That's correct. It's
and
already
so
done.
Settlement and reconciliation costs, essentially, at least in a spherical cow world, go to zero. And so there's a great cost savings that can simply be realized there. There are also time savings
Right?
that can be realized. And with time savings, now we start to see the first, instead of just lowering the cost or fixing existing problems, where we start to see more creative uses, okay? Because when you shorten the cycle, not just saving the money, but when you shorten the time, then you can start making decisions closer to real time.
Sure. This actually has a lot of applicability in the supply chain.
Right. And so now we
Right.
get into something that's more like the supply chain, where it's not just that we are reducing back office costs, but by shortening the time cycle, we're really starting to create new value, as opposed to, in those first two cases, sort of cost savings.
Right.
Now we're starting to make the transition to additional value creation.
Right.
And that really, you brought up the supply chain. It's a great example, because not only does it afford the opportunity to reduce settlement and reconciliation costs and cut the cycle down, it also, now we turn to the first time I've mentioned the word token, and the idea of creating liquidity for products that are participating in that supply chain in time.
Sure.
Okay. Now, I haven't talked about cryptocurrencies yet. I haven't talked about ICOs or tokens, but we just note in passing, first of all, that a distributed ledger can keep track of transactions.
Sure.
And from that, we can reify, if you will, the concept of a token. There's nothing magical there. We're just writing it down.
Right.
This went to this, this went to this. But we can start talking about quantization of an asset, whether virtual or backed off chain, or
Right.
a piece of equity or whatever. And so I think that third area is that we're going to start to see tokens become more securitized. And for me, that means two different things. One,
So that this is more real to people.
sure,
When you say tokenizing, everybody is very familiar with, say, owning your own home or
Right.
owning a piece of real estate. So the idea that you could create a token for a piece of real estate and then infinitely divide it
right,
is very easy to understand. So when you're talking about this idea of tokenization, it doesn't have to be, it can be a digital asset as well as a physical asset.
that's absolutely right.
Right. So the tokenization is only as it relates to that particular structure.
Yes,
Because the structure might be the supply chain. So the chain is moving, say, from raw materials to, refinement, to manufacturing, to distribution, to the end product.
sure.
So that product is changing, but it could be all tokenized along the way.
Right. It can be quantized,
Yes.
and therefore ownership of it can be fractionalized, and therefore assuming that and now I'll use a word for the first time, the transaction costs, which really means more than just the dollar and cent costs, but the degree to which there's friction in the system, and that friction can be lowered. All of that allows for creating a secondary market more efficiently that makes the asset liquid.
Right.
Quantized, fractionalized, liquid. And in that sense, I'm talking about it becoming securitized. And I'm sure there are aficionados in the financial services space that say, yeah, he doesn't really use that word right. And I'm happy to, concede defeat on that point. But let me just try to make a broader point. So I do think that you're going to see securitization in two senses. One, there's been, obviously in the United States at least, this whole discussion with the SEC and make creators of utility tokens versus security tokens.
Correct.
I do, without going into all of that, I do think we're going to move towards the security token side. Okay. And I don't think it's as big a problem as many would think. I think smart regulation, light regulation there can be a boon for all concerned.
Well, if we know what the rules are, then it becomes easy to work within them.
So, but in an additional sense, you've already alluded to, I think we're going to move from maybe this will actually appreciate in value someday because someone else will care more about it than me, over to things that are more like traditional equities.
That's like the greater fool argument that, I'm hoping that somebody else is going to value this more. So I was the fool to get in at this point, and now you're the fool because you take it away from me.
Right. There is a point at which Dutch tulips, which have intrinsic value, start to be valued in a sense that only can be satisfied by a greater fool argument. Okay.
Well,
and what I'm suggesting
I'm not disagreeing with you.
What I'm suggesting is that I'm not speaking to secondary markets that become out of control, that bubble and even super bubble. But there are different needs amongst different people, and that's why we trade goods. And so one person's perception of the value of something could rationally be different from someone else's because of the use that they need to put to it. And that's why liquidity is a net benefit. And we gain a liquidity premium.
Right.
So realizing the liquidity premium is part of this tokenization that allows for making both real as well as virtual assets, as well as stake of ownership in an entity, which is really somewhere between a physical asset and a virtual asset. That's unlocking that liquidity premium is a fundamental value creation economic driver.
Sure.
Okay, so in the second phase, if you will, for lack of a better word, I've talked about reducing costs, settlement and reconciliation. Now we're talking about unlocking a premium, okay, by making an asset liquid. Then I think you get to a fourth phase, for lack of a better word, that's going to take a lot more time to develop, but it goes to the notion of how tokens are used in an incentive system and how that changes the nature of the corporation. Let me try to offer a concrete example and then a more theoretical.
Sure.
Okay. LinkedIn. Okay. I'm guessing that you use LinkedIn.
I do.
Okay. As do I. Okay. LinkedIn was sold to Microsoft for a little over $26 billion in cash. Now, at the time of sale, and I often say this in an audience setting with a large audience, I say, look around at you and yourself and your neighbors and think, wait a minute, I'm the one that created all of the value in that LinkedIn network. All of these colleagues and friends that I stitched together, that's what that $26 billion is. Where's my part of that $26 billion?
Sure.
And so that gives rise to this notion that social media, in a broader sense, can be re-engineered with the right token incentive structures so that we have more peer-to-peer owned and regulated networks.
Sure.
They are, after all, peer-to-peer networks. The actual relationships that we have.
Right. The relationships are peer-to-peer.
And so I think there's great opportunity there. Okay. I think, but what is often seems to fall short in business plans that I look at is it is not a business plan to say the current social media are concentrated in power and therefore those people are bad. And so if I offer a non-concentrated alternative, then it must be good,
right? And
therefore people will use it. And no one cares, except for those that are genuinely driven purely by the philosophical argument.
Right.
Again, it carries great weight in my mind, but a business plan it does not make. And so one needs to come up with, and this is just a memo to those people that are sending us business plans, okay? You've got to actually create something better. Right. You can't just say what is existing is bad because it's centralized and decentralized will be better. you've got to create a compelling experience,
Right.
something that adds value even for early adopters of the system.
Sure.
And until you can do that, Facebook, LinkedIn,
They're going to own the
others
asset.
that, they are doing the best job.
Right, they are.
Okay? So knock yourselves out. I know it's coming. I know you can do it, but please hurry up because we're seeing a lot that doesn't work.